Hello, I'm Eliezer Yudkowsky. It's been a while, but I'm back to bloggingheads.tv. I'm a research fellow at the Singularity Institute for Artificial Intelligence, and with me today is Scott Aronson.
Hi, I'm Scott Aronson. I'm an assistant professor of electrical engineering and computer science at MIT, and I write a blog called Straddle Optimized. And well, it's great to talk to you, Eliezer. We have a lot to talk about. We actually tried this once before, had some technical difficulties. We're giving it another go.
And the first topic of conversation we are redoing today, actually, is the singularity. So yes. I thankfully have completely forgotten what we talked about last time. So we can start from scratch.
Okay.
Now, Scott, it seems pretty obvious to me that at some point in the not-too-distant future, we're going to build an AI smart enough to improve itself, and having improved itself, make additional improvements to itself, and it will go foom upward in intelligence, and by the time it exhausts available avenues for improvement, it will be a superintelligence relative to us. Do you feel that this is obvious? And if not, why not?
The main thing that I consider non-obvious in your statement is the qualifier "not too distant," in not too distant future. So here's the. I think our difference here is really a quantitative one, But quantitative differences, if they're large enough, can sort of look a lot like qualitative differences. So I mean, okay. So this. I saw this Blogging Heads that you did a couple years ago, I think, with John Horgan, right? And he sort of expressed what I think is the reaction of many people when they first hear about this singularity idea, which is that it sounds like completely crazy science fiction. It's the rapture of the nerds, right? Is the word used for it, right? Or it's this religious kind of fantasy that we're all going to have eternal life, we're going to be immortal, where the super intelligence is it's either going to create a utopia or a dystopia, one or the other. I mean, it just sounds so much like what people have been fantasizing about for such a long time, but just a new language.
It doesn't actually sound like that. It is recognized by them, so their brain completes the pattern and they fill in all this other stuff regardless of whether or not anyone has actually told it to them. They expect it to be there, so they just assume that it is there. Mm-hmm. I think it's fairly important to distinguish between things that are actually part of the position versus things that people expect ought to be there since their brain has categorized it as a fantasy, and then they just sort of make up all the details that they expect to hear.
Yes, well, I did say sounds like. I didn't say is like. I was just summarizing the reaction of most people to that because I wanted to contrast it with my reaction. I don't reject it in these terms. I think that if it first of all, if it is wrong, then it's certainly not obviously wrong. So the idea that we could build computers that are smarter than us, or that we could, and that those computers could build still smarter computers, and so on, until we sort of reach the physical limits of what kind of intelligence is possible, or that we could build things that sort of are to us as we are to ants, right? I mean, all of this is compatible with the laws of physics as I understand them, and I can't find a reason of principle why it couldn't eventually come to pass. So, as I said, I think the main thing that we disagree about is really the time scale. You said the not too distant future. I assume that by that you're talking on a span of decades. But
decades is fair.
Okay.
And if I'd meant 10 decades, I would have, or more, I would have said centuries. So,
yes.
1 to 10 decades.
1 to 10 decades. Okay. So
probably on the lower side of that.
Okay. So my sort of gut level intuition, and I haven't
just spit out your estimate.
Yes,
here.
Yeah, I know. We're you believe in Bayesianism, you believe in spitting out estimates. I think a few thousand years, seems more reasonable to me based on.
So in other words, considering where we started at the time of Galileo, and where we are now, you think we've got, 4 to 6 times the distance left to cover that we've covered already from Galileo's starting point to where we are now?
That's correct.
So you think that we've got, we don't even, 500 years is a lot of time in science, and we don't even know how much time 1,000 years is in science because we've never had 1,000 years of science.
That's correct.
So, where are you getting this estimate from? Like, why do you believe what you believe?
Okay, so I could, the obvious response, would be, where are you getting your estimate from? But that's maybe too glib. So where I'm getting it from is thinking about, for example, how much distance has been, traversed in the last 50 years of AI research, and in the 60s, for example, there are these famous stories that Vision was considered a summer project for an undergraduate, right? And what we realized is that we were actually in trying to build intelligent machines competing against a billion years of evolution in some sense, and it's a staggeringly hard problem. Now, a few thousand years, is really just a way of saying that sort of my uncertainty is in the exponent, right? It could be hundreds of years, it could be tens of thousands of years. At that point, the prior sort of just becomes logarithmic, right? And and that was, that's sort of the view that I would have formed just from what I know about AI, for example. And then the question for me is, well, should I revise my estimate just based on the fact that people like you, other people who've thought about this and whose judgments I respect, for some reason seem to believe that it's going to happen in some tens of years, and just so far I haven't found I just haven't found a compelling enough reason to shift to think that this is going to happen in 10 years.
I'd point out that if you literally use a logarithmic prior, that what I believe updating on the logarithmic prior ends up telling you is that you should expect it to take roughly as long as it's taken already. So counting from Dartmouth, which was I think 1955 or 1958 or something like that, it would be another 50 to 60 years. Now the thing is, if it does take, say, another 50 years, then 2 days before it actually happens, you'll be estimating 100 years in the future. And
okay, well,
that's
I'm not literally talking about a uniform prior over all exponents. That doesn't exist, first of all. There's not
it's an improper prior.
Yes. Yes. So what I mean is that I'm not prepared to say are we talking about 10 to the 3 years or 10 to the 4 years or something like that. But that between those two, sort of the uncertainty is in the exponent rather than in the base.
Well, for a species that literally only just started building serious computers around 65 years ago, I think it's, the idea that we've got, that AI progress has been so slow that we're looking at 100 times as much more work, it just seems pretty odd. And especially, I hate to say Moore's law, because by and large I feel it's a question of software rather than hardware.
Yes, and we also know that Moore's law is not a law at all. In some respects it's already stopped, in others it will stop very soon.
Moore's empirical regularity.
Yes.
And it's not even your friend, because Moore's law of mad science, every 18 months the minimum IQ necessary to destroy the world drops by 1 point, making it easier to build AI. So that you can be stupider and still build one is not necessarily a good thing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But when I hear a time estimate of 5,000 years, where has Moore's law ground to a halt? Like, do people have moon-sized computers or moon-sized superconducting, low-temperature, reversible quantum computers, and are they still unable to get human-level intelligence out of that thing.
I see that as a plausible possibility because I don't think that you would want to build a moon-sized computer. Probably you would probably be building things. You would probably be putting your effort into miniaturizing the components. But anyway, I see it as plausible that we could have quantum computers, for example, long before we had human-level AI.
Well, I agree, but that's because quantum computers offer a type of computing powers where it doesn't quite translate into doing whatever you want a human imagines it doing the way that modern computers do, which is, of course, a topic that you are very familiar with. So if there's any way to use the power of a quantum computer for the kind of artificial intelligence I'm interested in, I don't know what it is.
Right. No, and I don't either. I mean, you could get some speed ups for some of the basic tasks of AI, like search or like game tree evaluation, things like that. But these are not exponential improvements, or they're not believed to be.
Right. Square root of the exponent.
Things like that, basically.
Yeah. And what that means, I think, is something along the lines of, well, we've got Deep Blue and it's searching 1 billion moves per second, so it would be able to search twice as far into the search tree.
Yeah, right. So if Moore's law were actually a law, then it's halving the amount of time that you need.
If you're just sort of throwing brute force at the problem, then Moore's law actually speeds you up much more slowly than quantum computing. Quantum computing, if we had the same computers but they were quantum, then Deep Blue would be searching twice as far, whereas just throwing raw Moore's law at the problem without software improvements is just going to yield another ply or two of searching into the game.
Right. Well, switching to quantum computing is like a one-time thing, right? You do it and then you're on a different Moore's law trajectory, which is a little bit faster than the other one.
Right, but what it actually works out to, I think, would be a 9 months doubling time rather than 18 months doubling time if you had exactly the same progress, but it was all quantum.
Yes.
And I think that neither of us believes that Moore's law is going to continue 5,000 years into the future on the same trajectory.
That's correct.
But suppose I were to put it to you that when you say 5,000 years, what that actually is sort of an expression of an emotional reaction that implementing intelligence feels really, really hard to you, and when I elicit from you an amount of time, you choose a time that sounds equally impressive, and that comes out as 5,000 years. So it's not a time estimate, more of a making emotional change between two different currencies.
I think that's basically correct. I mean, I was basically admitting as much when I said that when I tried to explain just how much uncertainty there is. That it depends on all sorts of other things about how does civilization progress, how much. What sort of basic conceptual things have I not understood about this question? So, and as this gets into, I guess, another point of difference between us that sort of, I'm not willing to sort of extrapolate Bayesianism, into my sort of rationalist theory of everything in the way that you are. I'm willing to sort of be a Bayesian in limited domains where I feel like I understand, what does it mean to have a prior, what state space are we talking about, and so forth. But then, I'm not sort of willing to take that local Bayesianism and extend it into a global Bayesianism. But still, as a sort of as a game, since I do like to play games. You ask me for an amount of time until we develop super intelligence, and fine, I'll give you a number then.
Fair enough. Well, given that it hasn't actually happened yet, sort of trying to get a grasp on when AI will happen is very much a battle of the priors.
Yes, absolutely.
And those are always unpleasant for rationalists who know in principle that they ought to be able to exchange information to come to some sort of agreement, but most of their information is of the sort that's difficult to verbalize.
Yeah, unpleasant is a mild word for it. This is like the fundamental problem for Bayesians.
Yeah, so I had a similar sort of dilemma with Robin Hanson. We weren't so much disagreeing over the timescale to development of AI as disagreeing over what would happen once it was developed and whether it would go on that sort of sharp upward boom or just continue exponential growth with a higher exponent. And we actually threw very detailed arguments at each other, but then we sort of looked at each other's arguments and said, well, that doesn't make any sense, and it came down to the battle of the competing priors again.
Right. Well, I mean, the way I think about it is that
Sorry?
Oh, okay. So, I mean, I think about it that sort of there are two different ways that things could develop, right? So you've, in blog posts, often use this fable of 9 people in a basement just doing some math that will suddenly give rise to some super intelligence, right? And if that were the way that it would happen, then, I have sort of no intuition that tells me that couldn't happen 20 years from now. I mean, sort of conditioned on it happening that way. But I also sort of have I feel like a presumption that it wouldn't happen that way. And maybe I'm wrong, but that's just it's just not it just doesn't accord with my experience of what technological change looks like. It just seems to me that most technological change is much more of a global effort. It's not something that's done in secret by only a few people. Even if it is, then it's only like a very, very exceptional circumstances, like the Manhattan Project in the Second World War. So I feel like, in other words, I feel like conditioned on the superintelligence happening, I feel like we would have much more of a warning that it was coming than you seem to think. I feel like we would first see, ant level AI, we would see frog level AI, and we would see a whole series of intermediate things on the way.
I think we're up to ant level.
You do.
I think we're past ant level and heading for frog. I mean, we may not be ant. We may not be able to duplicate all the capabilities of an ant, but we can do a whole lot of things that ants can't do.
That's true.
And I think it's pretty fair to say that we're past the level of ant and heading for frog at this point.
Gosh, how do you judge such things?
I don't know. I mean, I don't mean to be underimpressed by the lowly ant,
yes.
And I'm not talking about the materials technology involved in the ant, the metabolism and so on.
Right.
But in terms of what the ant brain can do versus what modern AIs can do, I think that on the whole I'm noticeably more impressed with modern AIs than with an ant, although a frog might still be more impressive.
I see. Although, maybe you could take even the simplest organisms, and if you were to look at them at the cellular level, then that's still a great deal more impressive, probably, than even the best
but
AIs.
the cellular level is this whole different level of what has been optimized over how much time versus the brains of these creatures.
Sure. Okay, so actually, you might be amused to know. So I was at this workshop in the Azores like a month ago. It was sponsored by this FQXI, which is from the Templeton Foundation, actually. But they had us thinking about the consequences of superintelligence, and so we tried to do some sort of friendly AI theory, which I know is your area of expertise.
And what do you end up doing with
so
your ad hoc attempt at?
So I'll tell you. So just for the people listening in, so Eliezer has thought a great deal about the question of sort of, and he can correct me if I misstate it, but that supposing that we do create such a superintelligence, it seems awfully important to get it right the first time, right, and to make sure that it sort of shares the same sorts of goals, that humans do, rather than, let's say, wanting to maximize the total number of paper clips in the universe, right, and just converting all visible matter into paper clips, for example.
I think you're skipping over a lot of sort of interim logic there about the notions like the size of mind design space.
Okay.
That the values you perceive are a function of how a mind is constructed, and it's not that most of mind design space is paper clips, but most of mind design space is minds with values that we would find as not sort of alien beauty, but rather alien uninteresting.
Yes. No, but I think I actually liked your story of the paperclip maximizer. I think it does make that point, that we can easily imagine all sorts of AIs, even if they weren't malevolent. They might have goals that are just completely unrelated to our own goals, right?
And you are made out of matter that they can use for paper clips. It's
exactly.
not that they particularly hate you,
exactly.
but that they perceive higher value configurations into which you can be organized.
Exactly.
And it's something like paper clips where you just don't find those values interesting at all.
No, exactly. They don't hate me. They just see perfectly good raw material from our paper clips. Well, we came up with two ideas, and so I'd love to get your reaction to them as
Go
an
for it.
acknowledged expert in this field. So the first was that we should work on ways to guilt trip a potential AI. So we should want to tell it things like, oh yes, please, just go ahead. You were just so superior to us. There's not even a comparison. Just use the matter of our bodies for any purpose you deem appropriate.
It wasn't you who came up with this idea, right? This was someone else in the
Yeah. So we decided that some it was sort of a joint idea, but we decided that some research effort was needed into creating either a Catholic or a Jewish AI.
It strikes me that perhaps you are not taking this problem entirely with the gravity that it properly deserves.
Okay. Well, all right. So the second idea was a little bit more serious. So you can see what you think of this. So the idea was that maybe we could try to create an AI that sort of has the same relationship to us that we do to our genes. Right, so our genes, in some sense, are very, very stupid things compared to us, right? And yet, as we know from experience, they can, despite their relative stupidity, can exert an enormous amount of influence over us. Even if we understand exactly what's going on, even if we sort of regard,
I have to say that I regard the case of genes as sort of a paradigm case of loss of control, where we have no explicit drive either to maximize our inclusive reproductive fitness or to protect and make copies of the DNA composing us. And transhumanists like myself, which is to say people who have been properly exposed to their likely options, tend to see no qualms whatsoever relative to our values on changing substrate in such fashion that we leave our DNA and our carbon-based metabolisms completely behind, as long as we remain the same sort of people with the same emotions and the same values. We would say that nothing of much significance had happened in that change of substrate, except insofar as it insofar as it improves our quality of life in other ways. So from a perspective, so genes are stupid.
Yes.
They have no foresight.
Right.
They don't plan for things that are going to happen. Gene frequencies merely change in reaction to things that have previously happened. And I would regard the construction of human brains by the genes as a paradigmatic example of how not to do friendly AI.
I see. Okay, well, so just in this particular context, the idea was that you could imagine an AI that might be able to reason itself out of the idea that it should that it should bother at all with humans. It might see that as a complete waste of its time, and yet still, it just feels these urges to help humans. It just feels so good for it to help humans that it just can't help itself. So
I think you're sort of presuming that these minds are coming off a factory assembly line you don't control, with all sorts of values that you can't influence but can sort of appeal to and try to persuade it, as if you were talking to some human from the tribe who lives across the water, where you didn't build them and they come with all sorts of desires built in and you have to persuade them, rather than actually designing them from scratch.
Well, I'm not trying to make any presumption about what their desires are. I'm saying they may have desires that we can't even conceive of or understand. So I'm not trying to make a presumption about that. But I'm saying, the question is, can we design something which is much more intelligent than us, but that nevertheless, no matter what other desires it has, just feels constantly sort of impelled or steered in the direction of some particular desire. Just like with humans, we find that no matter how intelligent they are, they just seem just pushed constantly sort of upstream in the direction of certain things like wanting food and sex, right? And in fact, intelligence seems to bear little or no relation to it.
Okay, so this is sounding. I'm trying to even. There's a lovely little parable that I once heard.
Okay, sure.
At a science fiction convention, from someone who'd been around in the old days, and he told me about a science fiction TV show he watched back in the days when science fiction TV shows were a lot less sophisticated, and there were these people flying around in a spaceship and fighting aliens.
Okay.
And when the heroes flew through an asteroid belt, they always had to dodge the asteroids, which tumbled through space with a huge grinding noise. And of course, space was entirely full of asteroids, packed densely full of it. And the aliens, though, had this mysterious ability to dematerialize and fly right through the asteroids. So one time they discovered a derelict alien ship, boarded it, found the control room, and the captain of the hero ship looks at a lever and says, "Aha, this must be the lever that controls the dematerializer." So he pries up the lever, takes it back to his own ship, and now they can dematerialize and fly through asteroids. And I call this the detached lever fallacy.
Yes.
And the problem is that the problem is whenever you try to when people anthropomorphize AIs and they try to pull levers without thinking about whether or not you still have the machinery behind them. So if you say something along the lines of, well, we'll appeal to the AI's sense of duty, then you're assuming that the AI already has a sense of duty and you just need to pull the lever on it somehow.
Well, I'm not presupposing how this would happen. I'm just asking the question of how we can make it happen, since that seems like something we might want to do.
Well, if you can add one value and have it stable, then why are you assuming that there's these other values coming into it from nowhere, that you can't control its other values?
Well, because if we look at the analogy of humans, then we find that's the case, right? I mean, humans have all sorts of desires that have nothing to do with sort of what our genes want for us. If it makes sense to talk about them wanting. Well, I mean, the desire, to do higher math.
A friend of mine, Marcello Harrishoff, once compared math to ice cream. So ice cream has more sugar, salt, and fat in it than anything in the ancestral environment.
Yes.
It's a super stimulus.
Yes.
And in the same way, we evolved to do abstract thinking and even to enjoy certain kinds of abstract thinking.
Yes.
And for people who are sufficiently good at abstract thinking, we invented a kind of abstract thinking ice cream, which is more beautiful and elegant than any sort of abstract thinking you'd find in the ancestral environment.
Yes.
And that was what we call math.
Yes, no, I agree with your causal story. I mean, we people who do this, we basically are just gluttons for ice cream.
And some of us are gluttons for mathematical elegance. But it's the same. But in each case, even though you're doing something that has no analogy in the ancestral environment, your values are growing out of the emotions and other moral circuitry that were built by your genes. They're not happening sui generis, if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Right. Right. So, okay. So, I mean, we know the causal story in this case. If we're creating AI, we're going to have to sort of make our own causal story. But yeah. So.
It's not in loco parentis because parents don't get to choose their kid's source code.
Right.
They get to pull the levers.
Right.
They don't get to build the machinery.
Right.
So what we're looking at here is actually reaching into mind design space, pinpointing a possibility and pulling it out. Well, that's what you do if you're doing friendly AI. Otherwise, you're just sort of hacking something together because you think it's going to be cool.
Okay. So should we talk about many worlds?
Sure. We can call for that topic change at this point.
Okay.
So, many worlds. It is completely obvious that the process that has been called quantum measurement is no different from any other quantum process. And we'll take the case of Schrodinger's cat. an atom fizzes or does not fizz, which is to say that we've got a segment of configuration space in which the radioactive atom has decayed, and a segment and a little blob of configuration space where it hasn't decayed. And then the sensor, which detects the radioactive decay, goes into a superposition of firing and not firing, which is to say that the sensor becomes entangled with the distinctions that we now have a blob in which the sensor has fired and the radioactive atom has decayed, another blob in which the sensor is not fired and the radioactive atom has not decayed. The hammer either smashes the vial of poison gas or does not smash it. That is, we have one blob in which each happens. The cat goes into a superposition of being alive and being dead, and then the human opens up Schrodinger's box and looks, and the human, just like every other part of this causal process, goes into a superposition of seeing the cat alive and seeing the cat dead. So this is completely obvious. I'm wondering if there's any reason why you think it's not obvious.
Okay, so I think that it's not obvious because I think that it's the best it's the closest thing to an explanation that we have in some sense. So I think that many worlds, first of all, is a definite sort of clear improvement over sort of the type of talk about quantum mechanics that preceded it, which was known as the Copenhagen interpretation, and which sort of viewed measurement as this sort of process that you have to treat separately from the rest of quantum mechanics, right? So systems evolve, by sort of ordinary physical laws until someone looks at them, and at that point, a new physical law comes into play, namely this collapse of the wave function, right? And at
that point, the probability amplitudes go to zero because we know they're false. So the old Copenhagen interpretation didn't just treat measurement specially. It treated it as something ontologically, fundamentally mental. So that there were mind things like knowledge that were now supposed to be playing a basic role in physics. And some physicists were even saying explicitly consciousness causes the collapse.
Yes.
So in just talking about this as measurement being special, you're rather understating the level of confusion that was caused by not realizing the obvious fact that the macro world is just like the micro world. Things go into entangled superpositions.
Okay. Well, I mean, in fact, I would say that until recently, a large part of the problem that I had with the many worlds interpretation is just that it just seemed so obvious that you can view quantum mechanics this way that I just didn't see where the intellectual work was. And I thought, did it really take someone like Everett to point this out? Like, wasn't this obvious to Schrodinger, to von Neumann, to people like that?
No,
in the 1930s?
It wasn't. Yes, it did. It did take Everett.
Yes.
People really are that silly, to the shame of the human species.
So actually, this was another thing that came out of this workshop. I was mentioning we heard a talk from Peter Byrne, who actually has a book coming out, which is a biography of Everett, and I think has a documentary about him also. And seeing the actual history behind it helped me appreciate more that there was some intellectual work that happened here. I mean when you read Schrodinger writing about this in the 1930s, for example, like he did see this, right? He did see that yes, if you take the equations of quantum mechanics sort of seriously, if you take Schrodinger's equation seriously as a description of reality, then this is what it predicts. It predicts that you're going to evolve into, two copies, one copy of which, sees the cat alive and the other copy sees the cat dead, right? This is because, Schrodinger sort of, unlike Bohr or some of the others, was willing to sort of take mathematics seriously to just see where it leads, right? But then Schrodinger didn't really pursue that line of thought, much further, right? I don't, think he really sort of stomped his foot and said, no, this is really the way things are. This was just sort of one way that you could think about them, right? But
that's pretty sad.
Yeah,
pretty sad.
Yeah. So I mean. I think that it is doing intellectual work in the sense that you're what you can explain here is sort of why are you getting out of quantum mechanics the appearance of a classical world, right? That's sort of the thing that's being explained here, right? What's still not being explained to my satisfaction is sort of what's the what's the actual connection to what we observe, and in particular to the probability distributions over measurement outcomes that we observe.
The observed frequencies. Calling them probability distributions is presuming a bit. What we're talking about is a certain proportion of experimental results that are observed when we do certain experiments. So I don't know where the born probabilities come from either, but how could you possibly believe that any answer could postulate a single global world which would violate special relativity by Bell's theorem?
Well, I'm not convinced that actually many worlds, sort of makes the situation better with respect to special relativity. I mean, any interpretation, because they all, yield the same experimental predictions, at least for any experiments that we can do currently, right, are going to, they're not going to sort of violate, causality, in a way that would lead to sort of backwards in time signaling, right? I mean, but
there is no backwards in time signaling. Right. There is no violation of causality. The many worlds makes that perfectly clear, and then the other theories postulate, the single world theories postulate violations of causality, but because they have to match the predictions of many worlds, they are constrained to postulate violations of causality which can never actually be used to send signals. So I think that the idea that this is not a sin because it doesn't yield any testable, observable violations of causality is sort of an excuse that was historically developed within physics to deal with the fact that violations of causality were being postulated but then never actually observed. Now, if you just had many worlds from the beginning and this new single worlds theory came along, first thing you'd say when you looked at it is, this violates special relativity, and worse, it does so in a way which never lets me test it.
Right. Well, look, I mean, there are people who think that quantum mechanics itself, violates special relativity. In fact, there was a whole, cover article in Scientific American, fairly recently about this. I found it kind of execrable, right? Because, the idea is that if you look at quantum mechanics in a certain way, then yes, it doesn't matter if it's the many worlds interpretation or which interpretation it is. It seems to sort of require this faster than light signaling, right? And the reality is something that people, it's a logical possibility that people didn't even think of before quantum mechanics, which is something that's, that you can do things like violate the Bell inequality, okay, which are stronger than, which are not allowed by sort of a local realistic theory, but which, on the other hand, are not as strong as superluminal signaling. And I think, people didn't even recognize that there could be this third possibility, in between the two before quantum mechanics came along and actually exhibited it.
So I think we should sort of offer a bit of background for our confused viewers at this point. What Bell's theorem says is something along the lines of if measurements, sort of to describe it in the old classical way, if measurements were predetermined, that is, if you had predetermined results of particular measurements, then by saying, well, if we measure this particle one way and this particle the other way, we find that this happens 5% of the time, and we measure this particle one way, another particle another way. We find that that happens 5% of the time. If we measure them at these two angles, we find that this happens 20% of the time. And if it was predetermined, it couldn't happen 20% of the time. It could only happen 5 plus 5 equals 10% of the time at most. So that's sort of a very rough description of Bell's theorem, which otherwise you can look up online. I've written an essay that should hopefully serve to explain it to any audience that can read algebra. But the point being that you can't give a consistent, local, realistic description of reality if you assume that when you perform a measurement, only a single thing happens. Now, Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen pointed out that sort of the way in which this violates the spirit of special relativity, because it seems that depending on which measurement you choose to perform at location A, the probabilities at location B have to change, although never in a way which would let someone at B ever get a signal from you. They only change in a way that make the two results compatible once you bring them together again. And Einstein, Podolsky, and Roskin says, well, this contradicts special relativity, which is quite right if you assume that you only get a single measurement result at each location. Now, what Many Worlds says is, well, what Many Worlds says is, well, it's not that you're changing the probabilities at the other location. The experience probabilities at the other location are exactly the same. The world just divides into two blobs, and when you meet the other people, you find you're in a consistent blob. Now, this description that I just gave, taken at face value, still involves a sort of something that looks a bit non-relativistic, but what it is it's having the global description of some instantaneous slice through space, or rather an instantaneous slice of space through time. And this
1 sec. I'm
still
put some lights
sorry?
on. I'm going to put some lights on. It's going to go
Okay.
where I am.
Okay. Well, I'll just go ahead and finish up the explanation. And this still contradicts the spirit of special relativity. Still contradicts the spirit of special relativity to some extent, but there's no longer any actual probabilities changing at different locations or experimental statistics changing at different locations. All we have is a problem that looks like it could easily be a problem with the way we're describing things rather than a problem with physics. And if we just had a slightly different way of describing things, even the appearance of a problem would go away. But if you do have a single local world, then the choice of measurement at A has to affect the probabilities at B, and that has to violate special relativity. There's no way around that. And that's why, even though we still have some lingering puzzles in quantum mechanics around the Born probabilities, unless you want to say that things I can do can affect the Born probabilities faster than light, it seems to me you are committed to Many Worlds.
Okay, well, so, I mean, the arguments for Many Worlds, have the gist of saying, well, look, we can sort of resolve all these problems. All you have to do is sort of give up the assumption that measurements have one outcome, right? But, of course, when you do that, I think where the unease comes from some people is they feel, well, then, you're giving up what a scientific theory is supposed to be, part of what a scientific theory is supposed to do in the first place, right, which is to explain our observations. So this one little thing you're giving up, it seems like giving away the entire game. Now, I'll admit that the Copenhagen point of view, gives up enormous things, right? It gives up, the idea that we can sort of, factor consciousness out of our scientific theory, right? So, I mean, maybe one way to think about it is that the Copenhagen point of view just starts with our experience, our observations, our measurements as sort of the central thing, and then just is interested in the physical world, only insofar as it relates to sort of our observations. So it's this very subjectivist point of view. And it doesn't sort of give you a coherent way to talk about, well, what happens if you put yourself in superposition, right? Then what happens?
It doesn't allow people to be made of atoms.
Right. Well, it or at least if people are made of atoms, then what's doing the observation has to be some other kind of cell stuff, right? Which is
not made of atoms.
Well, right. Which is not your
it's,
brain, but which is something else, which is somehow looking at your brain. Right.
What the Copenhagen interpretation is giving up is nothing less than naturalism itself.
Yes. So right. So in fact, Peter Byrne, made an interesting point. He said that part of the issue with Many Worlds is that you really can't accept Everett until you first accepted Dennett. Right. And in other words, like until you're
I'm sorry, you actually just skipped out for me.
I did.
For a moment there. Yeah.
Oh.
Can you repeat that last sentence?
Yeah, that you can't be on board fully with Everett until you're first on board with Dennett. In other words, with the idea that that the brain really is just physical stuff and it's nothing more than that.
Just physical stuff? What other sort of stuff is there?
Well, that there's that there's not this sort of free will stuff. I mean, you could imagine some sort of stuff acting in this sort of not in physical space, but in Hilbert space, right?
But I'll certainly agree that
yes.
to modern ears incredible resistance of the early physicists to thinking of themselves as being made out of atoms. I mean, many of them were probably even outright religious. And thought they had souls because you could actually do that back in the early 20th century. So that may certainly have played a huge role in their missing out on the retrospectively obvious fact of many worlds. But where I don't see how you can possibly say that by postulating a single world you are gaining anything whatsoever back in the fashion of explanation. I mean, many worlds, for those of us who think that the Born probabilities are still up for grabs, says, here are the experimental statistics. And the single world says all but one world are eliminated by magic, faster than light, non-local, time asymmetric, acausal collapsor device in accordance with these statistics. So it's still handing you the statistics. It now just has a completely unphysical, magical mechanism producing them.
Okay, well,
and that doesn't gain anything back in the way of explaining observations.
Okay, well, what I was going to say is that, I think, these are sort of huge gaps in the Copenhagen point of view, that there's also, this, to me, serious gap in the many worlds point of view. I mean, one is sort of starting with experience as fundamental and then sort of not, having a coherent way to deal with the fact that we're made of atoms. The other is sort of taking, the evolution of a physical state as fundamental, but then sort of having trouble accounting for the fact that, well, the only way, as sort of Democritus put it, 2,300 years ago, right, the only way that we even know in the first place about this physical world is that, at the end of the day, we're able to make observations of it, right, and it's sort of not telling a story that makes a lot of sense to many people about what is an observation, right, and where does observation come out of the story?
Don't tell me what happens to many people. I mean, do you personally feel that you are gaining anything by postulating a single world instead of many worlds?
I feel like I'm not. I feel like I'm certainly less uncomfortable with many worlds than with Copenhagen, but I'm not as confident as you are that I understand the right way to think about it. Okay, so the way that
I don't see. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay, I was going to say, the way I think about it is that I look at I imagine as an analogy people arguing around 1700 or so about the origin of life, right? And it might have been obvious that there are a few possibilities. Either God did it, or maybe we were planted here by beings on some other planet, or maybe it was all random accident, right? And all of these seem like really lousy theories, but maybe the theory that it's just a random accident is not as bad as the other two, and so therefore, that one has to be the truth, right? Basically, I see a bunch of, several different interpretations of quantum mechanics, the many worlds, the Copenhagen, and then the Bohmian point of view, which we haven't talked about much, but they all seem lousy to me, and many worlds seem sort of less lousy than the others. But I'm willing to accept the possibility that we just, just like people in the 1700s, hadn't even come up with the possibility of natural selection. Maybe we just haven't come up with the right possibility yet. And
that's certainly possible. But whatever the correct theory it is, it has to be a many worlds theory rather than a single worlds theory, or else it has a special relativity violating, non-local, time asymmetric, non-linear, and non-measure preserving collapse process, which magically just causes entire large blobs of configuration space to vanish in such fashion that it is never detectable to us whenever the many worlds theory predicts that the blobs stop interacting with us.
Well, wait a minute.
Because they're too distant in the space.
Wait a minute.
I just don't see. So I don't see how your remaining uncertainty, legitimate as it may be, permits you to hold out any hope whatsoever of getting the naive single world back, any more than combining general relativity with quantum mechanics lets the Earth go back to being flat.
No, I was going to say, non-measure preserving seems a bit too strong. I mean, after all, the possibility that you observe then has measure one, right? So, no, I was, So look, I mean, it's
But by measure preserving, I mean the processes within quantum configuration space.
Okay.
Large quantities of measure are disappearing in this magical collapse process. Right? The things that had measure now have measure zero.
Yeah, but that's because that's what happens in the measurement process. But anyway,
yeah, God did it.
Okay. So, I mean, it's certainly, entirely possible to me that whatever, if we were to someday discover something, let's say, that replaces quantum mechanics, that it will be even stranger than the thing that replaced it. Even further from our sort of classical intuition of the world. So, I mean, I guess, what you forced me to realize, Eliezer, and I thank you for this, is that what I'm uncomfortable with is not the many worlds interpretation itself. It's the air of satisfaction that often comes with it.
Okay, so would you agree with me that the Born probabilities are this huge gaping hole in our understanding of the fundamental physical processes of the world? Mm-hmm. And would you agree with me mm-hmm. that whatever fills that hole, mm-hmm. there's absolutely no reason, given our present state of knowledge, mm-hmm. to think that a single world is going to come out of it any more than a flat Earth is going to come out of it?
I agree with the first part, not with the second part. I think that a single world, will always sort of remain a fairly attractive thing in possibility space. And I don't know. I mean, this actually this might be a little bit of a digression, but these sorts of issues relate a lot to sort of how I got interested in quantum computing, because it's. In some sense, we could build a quantum computer, and all of the debates about interpretation of quantum mechanics could go on just as before, right? Everyone can just sort of, reshuffle their cards, but just keep playing the same game, right? But in a way, quantum computing is built out of an effort to sort of test, well, if there really is this sort of enormous multiplicity of worlds, then sort of we know that quantum mechanics itself tells us that we can't visit the other worlds, right? We can't directly communicate with them. But can we at least get some kind of more explicit evidence that they're there than we've had so far? Okay, can we get, for example, a huge number of these different worlds or branches of the wave function, whatever you want to call them. If you don't want to call them worlds, that's fine. But can we get them to sort of all participate in a computation, like factoring an enormous integer, such that, we don't believe that if there was only one world or only one branch or only one path, that computation could even be done efficiently. Okay?
Well, is there any serious doubt in your heart whatsoever that you're going to find that all these, quote, other worlds, unquote, quote, exist, unquote? I mean, the Copenhagen-type crowd have always been sneaking peeks at many worlds equations to tell when many worlds says that the other blobs are sufficiently separate from us that they should no longer be observable, so that at that exact moment the Copenhagen crowd can say, aha, they've disappeared. Mm-hmm. Now, the standard equations say that when you do quantum computing, those other worlds are not yet distant enough to disappear. Mm-hmm. So, of course, the Copenhagen crowd will say that no collapse have occurred, and having thus stolen many worlds' experimental predictions, they will claim that there's no testable difference.
Okay, I mean, you could argue about who's stealing whose predictions, given that the Copenhagen view, came first, right? But fine, let's accept.
Came first has no rational meaning. I'm unable to.
Well, yeah, but you're using words like stealing. Okay, fine.
But by stealing, I mean that they have to peek at the many worlders' equations to tell when the collapse occurs, because their own equations make no mention of when the collapse occurs. So by peeking, I'm not talking about who came first. I'm talking about that they have to perform many worlds-type computations on the sly in order to tell when their collapse occurs.
Well, that's not really true. I mean, in all the experiments that people have actually done, they're sort of not in ambiguity in separating the sort of quantum world from the macro world, right? And again, quantum mechanics itself explains that. It explains why decoherence is sort of such a rapid process that that you don't in practice and in quantum experiments people know how to do. You don't actually have to worry about where the border is.
Well, what I'm talking about is the sort of thing where you take a half-silvered mirror and split a photon into two worlds, and traditionally the Copenhagen people say, aha, well, you measured it, it went down one course but not the other, but now I combine the two worlds and change the phase of one of them so I get a certain quantum result, and the Copenhagen people all take a quick peek at the many worlds calculations and their actual experimental results and say, aha, we changed our mind, measurement didn't occur after all. That sort of thing.
Well, okay. So I mean, I think that.
But I guess that sort of the real thing I'm trying to convince you of here is that a single world is ridiculous. We've got these wonderful, differentiable, continuous, time-symmetric, perfectly local, linear, measure-preserving equations over the configuration space.
Okay, well, the thing I'm trying to convince you of is that, it's not a choice between ridiculousness and sanity. It's a choice between different kinds of ridiculousness. So, I argue a lot in my day job with computer scientists who think that, the ability to factor an integer efficiently is ridiculous for this reason. They just take it as obvious, as sort of not even, an interesting question that, clearly quantum mechanics must be wrong if it predicts that you can do that. And,
well, factor the integers and tell them to shut up.
Yeah, well,
that's the wonderful thing about science. That's just
we're working on that, and I expect that there will be some who still won't shut up even then. But yeah, so maybe a demon came and factored the number, right? But yeah, but this is part of exactly why I think some of us got interested in this field, right? It's not about actually building faster computers, although that would be cool. There's no doubt about that. But it's about sort of testing quantum mechanics itself, sort of more stringently than it's ever been tested, right? Because the truth is, I think there is legitimate doubt about whether quantum mechanics is the final answer. I mean, my own guess would be that it is, but that's just because it seems to me like the most boring possibility. And,
but you keep on trying to sneak in uncertainty over whether there's a single copy of Earth or many copies of Earth into your uncertainty about whether or not quantum physics is the final theory. I'm totally on board with the latter kind of uncertainty. It's the existence of a zillions of copies of this Earth that science and experiment and math have established beyond a reasonable doubt at this point. And you keep on trying to smuggle your uncertainty about the final theory into your uncertainty about whether the other Earths exist.
Okay, but
I don't understand how you can do that.
Okay, because a theory that replaced quantum mechanics could just carve up conceptual space in completely different ways. I mean, think about before quantum mechanics.
But why do it in that particular way? Why do it in just exactly the right?
Why
not?
Okay,
but then why not? Why not? Why shouldn't the theory that succeeds quantum mechanics recarve the conceptual space in just such a way as to make giant pink dragons materialize in the sky, or put Russell's teapot out beyond Pluto, or show that atoms are secretly made out of chocolate? Why this one
all those seem
miracle?
To be adding a lot more Kolmogorov complexity to your description than just saying that there's one world.
But saying that there's one world violates continuity, differentiability, locality, relativity, time symmetry, causality. I could go on like this for days. You're talking about a specific miracle that we just have absolutely no reason to expect. Why are you focusing on this one miracle instead of saying the final theory may say that teapots violate conservation of momentum? Where, yes, teapots are these big complicated things, but so are entire worlds. I mean, by carving out just the right sector of configuration space to preserve a single world and all the things in it and none of the other worlds around it, you actually are saying something along the lines of, well, maybe in the final theory, angular momentum is going to be violated for teapots and for nothing else.
Okay, I mean, I see the switch from classical physics to quantum physics as a different category of thing than talking about whether there are teapots around Pluto, right? I mean, in because in this case we're sort of dramatically enlarging the configuration space of reality, and I see this as something that indeed my guess would be that we have to do, but it's at a the point is that when people argue about it, the sort of the point of disagreement seem to be not just about the evidence, but about what is the right way to think about the question. Okay, so about what is it that you want a scientific theory to do for you? What counts as a measurement?
I don't understand what's saying there's only one world, how it helps at all, even a smidgen, even a tiny bit.
Okay, so it helps in the sense that you might believe that this is the point of a scientific theory in the first place, that that we are these observers and we're supposed to explain the results of our observations. And if you say, well, the result of your observation could be any number of these different things, then you haven't done the basic thing that a scientific theory is supposed to do for you.
So in other words, if I put you on a computer and then made copies of you, there can be no scientific theory describing what you see, because different versions of you see different things, and we can see them all right there on the computer?
That's a very interesting analogy, because in fact that happens to be another situation. In fact, one of the most interesting other situations where at least my intuitions about what I would want a scientific theory to do for me do in fact break down, and I don't know the right way to think. So I mean, you've probably heard of this sort of Dr. Evil paradox, right? Where so Dr. Evil.
Well, we're actually going into a bit of overtime right now, so why don't we finish up the Dr. Evil paradox and then conclude?
Sure. So you could imagine Dr. Evil on a moon base saying that I am threatening to destroy the Earth, and as our defense against that, we could say, well, we've created 200 exact replicas of you, and if you try to destroy the Earth, then we're going to torture all of them. And now, because they really are exact replicas, you should assume that probably you are one of those replicas, right? And therefore, you're much more likely to be one of the people who gets tortured than the real you. Okay, and I mean, these are sorts of situations where, in some sense, our usual tools of science don't sort of help us very much in figuring out how we should think about them, because.
But you can't say, well, because I don't know how to think about this problem, therefore it is forbidden that this problem be handed to me. I mean, if your brain were on read-writable hardware, I could present you with the Dr. Evil problem. And reality, in the form of quantum mechanics, where worlds are splitting all the time, has presented us with multiple copies of ourselves experiencing multiple problems. It happened. It's a fact. You don't get to say, well, the job of a scientific theory is not to handle this sort of thing, therefore it didn't happen. That's medieval philosophy, man.
Well, no, I didn't say that we're forbidden from thinking about it. In fact, I hate that kind of move every bit as much as you do. What I said is that I don't know how to think about it. But maybe we should wrap it up here.
Okay. And I have been Eliezer Yudkowsky for the Singularity Institute for Artificial Intelligence, and I'll take the last few seconds to put in a plug for the Singularity Summit 2009 in New York on October 3rd and 4th.
Okay, so great. I have been and continue to be Scott Aronson from MIT.
Be seeing you.
Okay, see you. Bye.